you all for coming today, especially with the weather outside. This is the first briefing in our 2011 U.S. Congressional Briefing Series with the International Conservation Caucus Foundation. I see a lot of new faces here, and that's exciting, and a lot of old friends. So welcome to everybody. I'm going to kick off just by talking a little bit about the ICCF in general, and then I'm going to hand it over to the Wildlife Conservation Society's Kelly Allward to introduce our speakers and talk a little bit more about what we're specifically going to be talking about today. The mission of the ICCF is, it is our belief, as the U.S. has exported capitalism and democratization, that it is also in our interest to support good natural resource management, biodiversity protection, and biohabitat protection in the developing world. One of the most important things we look at and focus on at the ICCF and talk about is why conservation really matters. And that is, when it all comes down to it, people. We talk about conservation and good natural resource management and its strong links to poverty alleviation, sustainable economic development, regional security, conflict avoidance, global health, global freshwater security, and also global food security. And we are very interested in how conservation and biodiversity protection is really related to people's livelihoods. Because at the end of the day, what will be successful in any conservation project is that it actually helps empower the people on the ground and allows them to sustainably economically develop. We are very pro-development, but the right type of development. And that's something that is consistently prevalent in all our briefings, whether it be this year or past years. Our advisory council at the ICCF is made up of the 4 largest U.S.-based international conservation NGOs. I believe all of them are represented in some ways today. We also have what we consider the strongest collaboration of multinational corporations and conservation NGOs that push for U.S. leadership on conservation. And so we've got a great group here, and a lot of some of their representatives will also be here today. But it's pretty amazing to see the collection that we have from Rainforest Alliance to Exxon, from Unilever to National Geographic to Coca-Cola to Starbucks and Cheetah Conservation Fund and African Wildlife Foundation. So it's a pretty impressive coalition, and we do briefings throughout the year that tie these partners and what they're doing, whether they be in the corporate or NGO sector, into conservation and how it's impacting people's livelihoods. Talk a moment about the U.S. Congressional ICC. I don't know if anybody picked up a membership list on the way in here, but if your boss is not a member of the ICC in the House or the Senate, I strongly encourage that he become one. It's not a policy decision or a voting decision. It's really just giving us your ear and allowing us to talk with you, with the member and y'all, the staff, about these important issues. This just gives you an idea of who our congressional leadership will be for this congressional session, the 112th. We have the co-chairman of the Senate. Senator Rob Portman has agreed as a freshman senator to take the co-chairmanship. He was instrumental in doing a lot of good stuff in conservation in the House, but he's taking one of the co-chairs in the Senate. We have Senator Olympia Snowe, Senator Tom Udall, and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Our co-chairman in the House, Andrew Crenshaw, who's been very active with us, but has now become a co-chairman. Representative Ben Chandler, Norm Dix, and Ed Royce. I believe Ed is now the only original co-chair that's left from the founding co-chairs that back in 2002. Our caucus is widely regarded, I'm not sure the statistics right now, is the 2nd largest bipartisan caucus in Capitol Hill. And you can see from those statistics there that we really have, that the caucus has really done a great job of being balanced and bringing in all sorts of people with different beliefs that agree that conservation and good natural resource management are critical for the developing world to sustainably develop and for U.S. national security. The Conservation Council of Nations is a new program or new project by the ICCF. Right now we have 28 member countries, and the idea is we're trying to create a bilateral, multilateral exchange between our congressmen here and other people's parliamentarians abroad. Russian parliamentarians have started a caucus in the Russian parliament. Canada has also started their own conservation caucus. So we're hoping to spread it to more countries very soon. You get an idea of some of our founding members. The actual official launch of this will be in May, but so far there are 28 members and growing. And so we're pretty proud of that collection and look to do a lot more bilateral and multilateral missions and events with other parliamentarians. This is a new organization that will come under the umbrella of the International Conservation Caucus Foundation. It's called the Oceans Caucus Foundation, and it's really going to help support, at first, the new Oceans Caucus that is being developed in the Senate. And we're very excited to be working on these issues that are becoming more and more important and critical to all the livelihoods, especially when we think about where the majority of the food is coming from in the world. I'd like to encourage everybody to go. We have a new interactive website that's pretty substantial. We also have a part of our website with an interactive map that ties in the issues of conservation and good natural resource management to poverty alleviation, sustainable economic development, regional security, conflict avoidance, global food and water security. So it's a wonderful opportunity to see actually why conservation really matters and how it's impacting people right now. And there's also a portion on that interactive map that talks about opportunities where corporations, NGOs, and even governments can get more involved. I will be giving it over to Kelly right now. This is we're going to be talking about the U.S. leadership on critically endangered global iconic species today. And Kelly Allward, if you're here, if you want to, here you are. If you want to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. And to the entire ICCF team for hosting the briefing today. Really appreciate all of your support on Capitol Hill. I see a lot of friendly and familiar faces today, and so thank you everybody for coming. I'm Kelly Allward. I'm the Washington Director for the Wildlife Conservation Society. We've been around for over 100 years with the mission of saving wildlife and wild places. We're headquartered up at the Bronx Zoo in New York, and we're responsible for managing the world's largest network of urban wildlife parks, connecting the Bronx Zoo to the New York Aquarium, the Central Park Zoo, and the Prospect Park Zoos. And being able to bring the science and the work that we do from 65 countries around the world to the zoos allows us to really communicate the importance of science and conservation and species protection to about 4 million visitors that we have come through our gates every year. And so, it's really a pleasure to come and as a member of the Advisory Council of the International Conservation Caucus Foundation and a member of the steering committee of the Multinational Species Coalition to bring my two favorite groups together today and talk about one of my favorite topics, which is species and critically endangered and globally important species, and connect these issues to you here on the Hill, at the agencies and other stakeholder groups around the country. And we wouldn't be able to have forums like this if it weren't for the co-chairs of the caucus. So really appreciate all the support we've received in previous Congresses from Mr. Royce, from Mr. Rogers, Norm Dix, as well as John Tanner. And we're excited and we welcome two new co-chairs to the House, Mr. Chandler and Mr. Crenshaw. And we're really fortunate that these issues have been bipartisan in the past, and we've enjoyed support for the species funds through the Congress from members such as Don Young, George Miller, Henry Brown, Madeline Gordillo, Doc Hastings, and Mr. Rahal. And we hope that continues into the future. And so wanted to just spend a moment. There's lots of folks from the Species Coalition here. Our coordinator, Andy Oliver, you're going to hear from her later, is here and new to us, but maybe not new to many of you folks as she spent some significant time on the Hill in the past. Our coalition is wonderful. We are very broad and diverse, ranging from companies like Feld Entertainment and Disney to conservation organizations, zoos, and aquariums, and animal rights groups, and everything in between. And so I hope you take advantage and call upon our coalition for more information about these important issues for species conservation. And so, you know, you may be thinking, why is species conservation and U.S. leadership important to you and your boss? Global conservation is inextricably linked to the health and security of all Americans and the protection of U.S. interests overseas. U.S. has been a historic leader in global conservation, and we find that, you know, species conservation, when the U.S. government invests in species conservation, it attracts other donors from all sorts of places because there's security and comfort and assurance that the U.S. government is picking the right places and the right things to invest in. And so we want to impart that today to you as you hear from our speakers. And just so you are familiar with the species funds, they were started in 1991, and they're administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through the Office of International Conservation. Herb Raphael, the chief, is here with us today. Welcome. And they have grant programs, competitive grant programs for specific iconic species. So tigers, rhinos, great apes, African elephants, Asian elephants, and marine turtles. You may not know this, but the U.S. government is the only country to have a dedicated fund for tigers. And with tigers being in such dire circumstances around the world, 3,200 left in the wild, there was just a tiger summit, and Russia hosted it in St. Petersburg. And in the lead up to this, we realized that, you know, the U.S. government, yet again demonstrating leadership on tigers, has a dedicated fund at the Fish and Wildlife Service for this important program. Right here. And so I wanted to just touch briefly on a couple successes that we're familiar with, and then the speakers are going to tell you in much more detail about this. But you know, there's also a Wildlife Without Borders program that's important, also run out of the same office at Fish and Wildlife Service for capacity building, addressing cross-cutting threats like global health, like the amphibian decline, trade in species, bushmeat trade, for example, and community efforts to address conservation declines and threats. Why the Wildlife Conservation Society cares about these funds is because we find that they have been pivotal, if not instrumental, in some of the most important discoveries in the last decade. For example, these funds have helped support the discovery of 125 western lowland gorillas in the Congo, where we thought there were fewer than 50,000. They've supported the discovery of 42 leatherback sea turtles off the coast of Gov't, and they've contributed to the discovery of 1.2 million animals, including 8,000 African elephants in southern Sudan. And so these programs are key. They have been instrumental in the conservation efforts, and we see conservation as a key part of sustainable development, stabilizing many countries that are often developing new economies and new sources of resources, looking for other ways to build up their economies other than natural resource exploitation. So today you're going to hear again about the plight of tigers in the wild. I wanted to make you aware there's only 1,000 breeding females left in the wild. And the Wildlife Conservation Society is very concerned about this. We're putting up close to $5 million to on-the-ground conservation projects in Asia for tiger conservation. This is coming from a variety of bilateral sources, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and multilateral institutions like the Global Environment Facility and the World Bank. And we anticipate that over the next decade, the WCS will be investing upwards of $50 million in tiger conservation on the ground. And I hope that you take away from today's session that zoos are playing a major part in species conservation. At the Bronx Zoo, where Joe and many of our other scientists work out of our headquarters, we also have a Congo exhibit, and about $10 million has been raised from the admission price to get into the exhibit, and is going directly to field conservation programs in Central Africa to help species like great to Joe Walston, who is the director of our Wildlife Conservation Society Asia Regional Program, and you'll hear much more from him. Joe has been with us for 13 years at the Wildlife Conservation Society. He joined WCS in 1999 to lead the first surveys of the Cambodian forest since the Khmer Rouge, and he served in Cambodia for 7 years, and then 4 in Gov't and other areas in Africa. So you will hear a nice representation of work in the status of species in both Asia and Africa. Joe recently moved to our Bronx Zoo headquarters last year to become the regional director for the Asia program. And I have a little note here that says, Joe has always been lifelong interested in nature, but his degree is actually in mathematics. And he was told he couldn't really do wildlife. But he has overcome and persevered, and he's brilliant, and we're very fortunate to have him here with us today. Joe.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Joe, as you know, and I'm delighted to have brought my British weather with me today, so for you to share it. I've got this 10 minutes, and I thought I could talk to you about some of the species-specific activities and the funds they've got, but actually I thought what I would be a more useful use of my 10 minutes was actually to give you just 2 very specific personal case studies. Because for the last 16 years I've been living in Southeast Asia and Africa, and only in the last 6 months have I returned to the developed world, and I thought I'd give you 2 of these case studies from both Asia and Africa. I want to start in Africa because what I want to tell you a little bit about is how the US government in my time, the last 16 years, has been supporting activities from the very beginnings through to quite advanced stages. And when I talk about, again, the US's support, I'm really talking about quite a number of different agencies. And one of those remarkable things actually to me is that these agencies very much deliver more than the sum of their parts. It's the nature of those agencies, the type of commitments they provide, the length of time they provide it, the scale of it, that actually come together to have a remarkable impact. So I'm going to start in Central Africa, in the Congo Basin, where many years ago we started off with some very specific exploratory grants through the US Fish and Wildlife Service, which led to us being able to get into some of the most remote, troubled, conflict areas of Central Africa, and to really start exploring about what the opportunities were, what the threats were, and how we could really help. Now, the strength of the grants at that stage were, we don't need you to provide us with a very a specific day-by-day account, because we know the situation in the area, but we are going to support you, and we are going to ask you to come back and tell us what that situation is and find out what can be done. Now, from those very preliminary days, we have watched as programs and influence have grown from individuals going in and working with communities and governments, sometimes governments who've changed very quickly and not so peacefully. And now we have today not just the US Fish and Wildlife Service, we still have the US Fish and Wildlife Service, but we have a number of other US agencies, including the USAID, state, US Forest Service, who are now contributing to what is a vast program of improved governance in the Congo Basin. And 48 million hectares of forest now in the Congo Basin are under improved conservation management. And this can be traced back to many influences, but in terms of improved forest protection, management, and the increasing populations of wildlife there, improved tenure for local communities over their forest resources. A lot of this comes back to the early and current investments that the US government has been making in that area. So again, 48 million hectares are currently under improved forest management thanks to the various investments. This is okay. We can now demonstrate this as well. The nature of the US government's money has been such that we can provide evidence for this, not just anecdotal, but if people want to be able to see reductions in forest and biodiversity loss, if people want to see what's happening in some areas of improving populations of wildlife, if people want to be able to know how many communities are being supported with livelihood activities, then that is actually there. I should say that the nature of the funding of these various different groups is also key. USAID works on a different scale and has different requirements to that, say, of some state or US Fish and Wildlife Service. And they're incredibly complementary. And it's only when you get down to the field level, where you're working in governments and areas which are chaotic sometimes, unpredictable, that you realize that the ability of these supporting units with each other is absolutely crucial. The incredible responsiveness of, again, groups like US Fish and Wildlife is absolutely essential. The ability, if you can make a justified argument, if you can make it clear, if you have government support for it, if it's backed up and defensible, they have been fantastic at being able to support it under many difficult and varied conditions. Work also doesn't directly flow just to being able to work with our gorillas and tigers and other species that we're passionate about, but we're working with men and women on the ground who ultimately are suffering from lack of good governance, but also are going to be crucial in being able to decide the future of these species. And the work with these guys on the ground has resulted in some of the most threatened species in the world, the most iconic species in the world, being put under better protection. It also has a very tangible output. We can talk all about the variety of benefits, but from a ground perspective, we are talking about some very, very basic activities. Rule of law. Rule of law in places in the Congo isn't as straightforward as easy as it is in some other parts of the world. But the US government investments in all its shapes and forms are helping people take greater power and authority over the management, the rule of law in their areas, in their communities, are emboldening people to take stronger action themselves. It is propelling sometimes illegal activities from a number of different sources, sometimes within countries, sometimes without countries. And those men and women on the ground understand better than anyone the connection between their livelihoods and the environment in which they live. I'm not going to show you too many pictures actually of wildlife today, although it would be a shame if I didn't. So at least in the Congo Basin, these are some of the species we've been working on and directly benefiting. Again, where things are uncontrolled, where there is no governance, this is what happens. Rapid, clear felling, and even more significant than that, after the clear felling, land grabbing. And it's that lack of governance and that land grabbing means that the most vulnerable communities, the forest dwelling communities, are the ones who immediately lose out. The people who benefit are usually outsiders and power brokers at a local level, where might on the ground usually results in greater financial gains. So when we talk about some of these grand terms, a lot of it's this. A lot of it's stopping illegal poaching, not for sustainability, not for feeding the family, but supplying the international global trade in wildlife products, whether it be ivory from the elephants going to the Far East, or other products going for perceived medicinal or health benefits, or the international trade in trophies. It's also very much working with communities and kids here. So before I summarize on Africa, I want to take you to Cambodia, on the other side of the world, where my kids were born. I spent the first 7 years of my work with WCS here, and I got in actually in '98, in the 2 years just as the Khmer Rouge were moving out of the last two strongholds in the north and the east. Nobody had any idea what was there. Nobody had any ideas where we could actually get to at all. And again, the US Fish and Wildlife Service provided the first grants for us to get in there, find out what the priorities were, were there any wildlife, where were the true priorities for us to get engaged in, and what should that engagement look like. For those of you that know, it's Cambodia. And we, using camera traps, these heat in motion sensors on camera traps we placed in the forest, we started discovering that actually there was a lot left in Cambodia, but only in a few remote places, and that had a strong correlation with where the Khmer Rouge were still holding out in those north and east areas. We designed conservation programs around this. There is a whole wealth. These are all pictures from the smallest bear in the world to the largest cat in the world, one of the only places to have 8 primates and 9 carnivores in one site. A huge range of globally threatened species that live nowhere else on Earth. And for those of you really interested, small ones as well. Anyway, on the Vietnamese border, we found road building exercises which happened very quickly. Cambodia is a flat and open country. Once security improves, and this is the key point, when security improves, it's almost too late. Because by that time, you will have road building exercises, you'll have companies in there from, well, not companies, usually military and military businesses, and strongmen in there converting areas. And so we really needed to be there before things actually opened up. And allowing us to be there helped us support the government with their nascent efforts to improve the basic rule of law, stop, again, the illegal poaching and illegal trade, both logging, land grabbing, and poaching. Remember, the same people who are hunting ivory to sell to the Far East are those people who are also logging, again, clearing land, claiming it, and removing it from its natural, its traditional tenure systems with communities there. Again, the US government has been very strong on demanding from us evidence for what we're doing. And we have provided this both through our government partners, but also to the US government in a variety of different ways. But here is a patrol effort. This is, again, Khmer Rouge territory till '99. Now, government teams are patrolling these areas, and we have both snare rates coming down, we have hunting detection coming up, and again, when we're talking about hunting, we're not talking about hunting for consumption or local use. This is outsiders predominantly coming in to poach the last tigers and elephants in this case. We have strong landscape ideas of what's going on, and we are now developing landscape level approaches. Now, when we first started, again, we had programs like EAPEI, the East Asia Pacific Environment Initiative, which was funded through a USAID program. We now have USAID putting money into large-scale 5 to 7 year programs in the area, improving agriculture. We've got the US government in many different shapes and forms now providing different support. These are all tied together, but fundamentally it was the environment money that really first started operations in there. This village is the first in Cambodia to get indigenous land tenure recognized at a legal level. The first village. Wasn't done by an agricultural NGO, or wasn't done by another government. That was WCS with US money, wildlife money. And getting tenure for that community has actually helped wildlife conservation in that area. There's less logging, there's less poaching, there's greater stability, and communities themselves are now more in favour of being able to maintain this forest cover under protected areas and good forest management. We have money coming in from other sources. There are local businesses opening up. People are now doing small-scale ecotourism. There are adult literacy and numeracy programs going on. All this stems from early investments made at a time when people didn't really think, why in a poor country would you put money into wildlife conservation? Because environment and wildlife conservation and wildlife and the environment are absolutely central to those people who are most vulnerable, i.e. rural and forest-based communities in countries like Cambodia, Congo, Gabon. Outcomes: deforestation. You can't see it here. The blue line is where we're working. The red line is our other sites outside that landscape. We can demonstrate in every site we're working that in almost all measures, conservation money is having a profound impact on, again, livelihoods, forests, forest loss, and general forms of governance. Demographics. There's not just population growth, it's actually where people are moving. When security comes back to an area, fluid demographics, not just people moving back to their areas, but people occupying new areas, usually strong men moving in people to grab and claim land. Those people are moved around, they don't have tenure themselves, they're just being led to occupy areas. Again, where we're working, it's been extremely low. Red is the neighbouring area. Skip through this is wildlife populations, but of course we care about wildlife. We want to be able to see tigers and elephants increasing over time. And now where we are now, from our early investments down in this area, WWF have a large conservation program up in this area as well. WCS and WWF have been coordinating our efforts in this large landscape. We have a vast area that for a long while, we were two of the only 4 NGOs in this part of the country in Cambodia. And we're now at a state whereby, as development opens up, there are 300 mining and logging concessions now in this overall landscape. But where it is now designed, they are not in these areas, and they are better designed around where people are not living, where wildlife and global biodiversity values are not the highest, and they're being planned at a scale that is appropriate, both through local consultation, but in respect to a contiguous, connected conservation landscape. So before I finish, I just want to leave you with one story again, which is that in 1998, it was a $55,000 grant that started this work in eastern Cambodia. Today, the multiple donor agencies are putting $116 million into this landscape. But that $55,000 came from the US Fish and Wildlife Service and was the first grant ever to get the international community into this site to start exploring what the priorities were and how it happened. Now, we can't claim all the credit for that $55,000 turning into that money, but I do want to make it very, very clear that it was the boldness of those decisions, even on a relatively small scale, and that has transformed it into one of the most positive stories in Indochina at the moment. And finally, that this story can be repeated in a number of other countries around both Asia and Africa that I've experienced at the moment. So from a very personal level, I'd just like to finish by saying a very, very big thank you to those elements of the US government that have not only funded and supported our work, but the people that are still there in Montelkiri and the Congo Basin, who I think are doing an amazing job. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Will Garchor. I'm with World Wildlife Fund, with our Government Relations Department. And I just want to acknowledge our partners with WCS. It's great to be doing this briefing with them, alongside the fieldwork we do, and then our partners at ICCF and the Multinational Species Coalition. I'm just going to say a real quick word about WWF and then hand it over to our speaker, Matt Lewis, who I'll introduce very quickly. WWF is one of the world's leading conservation organizations and has been for decades now. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. We've got 1.2 million members in the US and 5 million around the world. We work in 100 countries around the globe. We work on conservation from a local to global level, both working with local communities, with national governments, with with regional networks and through international organizations. WWF US is focused on conserving 19 priority ecoregions around the world. 4 of those are in the US, in the Alaskan Arctic, in the Great Plains, in the Southwest, and in the river systems of the Southeast. And then our other programs are in Africa, Asia, Latin America. I'm going to introduce Matt, who will focus on our Africa programs. Matthew Lewis is a senior program officer with WWF, specializing in African species conservation. He's been a member of WWF's species conservation program since 2004. Before coming to WWF, Matt worked as a wildlife biologist for the Lower Brule Sioux tribe in South Dakota, helping the tribe restore bison, swift foxes, and black-footed ferrets to the reservation, as well as helping them to manage tribal fish and wildlife resources. Prior to that, he worked as a wildlife biologist for the federal government in the Pacific Northwest on endangered species issues. Matt's also served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Kenya, helping communities to conserve their indigenous forests. He's a Missouri native with a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Southwest Missouri State University and a Master's of Science in Fisheries and Wildlife Biology from Arkansas Tech University. So Matt is going to talk about rhinos primarily, and also a little bit, even though there are no tigers in Africa, a little bit about the outcomes of the Global Tiger Summit, which we participated in alongside WCS. So Matt Lewis.
Thanks, Will, and thanks, Joe, for your great presentation. And thanks to everyone for turning out on what's turning out to be a really nasty afternoon. And I hope after we finish that everyone makes it home safely tonight. I'm filling in sort of on the spur of a moment's notice for my boss, Sibylla Klinsendorf, who was on the agenda to speak today, but unfortunately fell ill at the last minute with laryngitis and lost her voice, and it was impossible for her to speak today. So I filled in for her. That's why there are a bit on tigers in this presentation, which is outside my area of specialty. But I'm going to try to muddle my way through it, so please give me some forbearance with that. If I can figure out how to operate this machine, I will get started. So the focus of my presentation today is really going to emphasize the importance of partnerships on challenging global forces. Go back to just making sure it works. Okay, no problem. So the importance of partnering to address issues that are global in nature that may seem too daunting and too overwhelming to handle if we try to tackle them individually, one-on-one. And in this area that we work in, conservation, it can be a really overwhelming field. It's very seldom that we hear great news in conservation, but day in and day out, we're constantly confronted with yet another poaching issue, yet another species on the verge of extinction. We're constantly challenged with bad news, and it's very easy to fall into this trap of feeling overwhelmed by all these forces that are acting against us. And the takeaway message is that, yes, it can be very difficult to take on these challenges ourselves, but if we partner and join forces together, there is really nothing that can't be solved through partnering together to tackle these challenges. The first, I'm going to talk about 2 case studies, as Joe did. I'm going to focus on 2 species. The first I'm going to talk about are rhinos. And I'm going to start with what may be some sort of elementary information, because I'm not sure what everyone's level of awareness of species around the world is, but I think from my perspective, I think the majority of folks associate rhinos with the African savannas. It may not be common knowledge to everyone that there are 5 species of rhinos in the world, 3 of which are found in Asia, and 2 of which are found in Africa. Not only in the savannas where you find African rhinos, but the Asian rhino species often are found in dense tropical forests in Southeast Asia. The story of rhinos is one that is a mixed success story with a lot of setbacks and challenges. The white rhino of Africa is probably one of the most amazing conservation success stories of all time. Around the turn of the 20th century, around 1900, there were a handful of white rhinos left, probably less than 100. And over the past 100 or so years, 110 years, they have made an astounding recovery. Today, they number more than 20,000 white rhinos. So that's one of the most amazing conservation success stories that we can point to. Similarly, the Indian rhino, which is found in northeast India and in southern Nepal, went through a very similar trajectory. About 100 or so years ago, they were down to just a handful of individuals. and have also made a pretty significant recovery. Not quite to the level of the white rhino, but the Indian rhino today numbers in the thousands, probably about 3,000 or so, and is continually growing. The good news is that 3 of the 5 rhino species are growing. Their populations are growing, are continuing to grow. 3 of the 5 species are categorized as critically endangered among the World Conservation Union's red list of threatened and endangered species. 2 of them are vulnerable. In fact, 2 of the Asian species, the Sumatran rhino and the Javan rhino, are probably among the most endangered large mammals on Earth. The Javan rhino numbers less than 50 individuals in total of all there is on Earth. The vast majority of them are found on the island of Java. There was a small population remaining in Vietnam. One was found killed last year, which could have been the last individual, so that subspecies of Javan rhino in Vietnam could now be extinct. The Sumatran rhino numbers only in the low hundreds, 200 to 300, 400 individuals throughout peninsular Malaysia, the island of Sumatra, and Borneo. What's driven these rhinos to the brink of extinction in most cases has been the demand for rhino horn, primarily in Asia for medicinal purposes, but traditionally as well there was a second market for rhino horn, which was the Arabian Peninsula, primarily Yemen. The rhino horn was used to make handles for a traditional type of dagger in Yemen, known as a jambia. So traditionally, rhino horn would travel, especially from Africa, to the horn, the Arabian Peninsula, where it was carved into dagger handles. Any remaining pieces of rhino horn that could then be ground into powder were transited on to Asia, where they were used for the traditional Chinese medicinal market. Now, through good awareness mechanisms, through good enforcement, the Yemeni demand has primarily dried up. We're not seeing a huge influx of rhino horn going to Arabia anymore, but the Asian demand has only increased, and in fact has now hit what we think is at least a 15-year high of rhino poaching, primarily driven by demand in Asia. And there's a very strong correlation between the growing economies of East and Southeast Asia and the demand for wildlife products, especially rhino horn. I'm going to give a few specific numbers to hammer that point home, especially from South Africa. And these are numbers from the past year of poaching incidents that occurred in South Africa. Now, South Africa is home to, by far, the majority of all rhinos on Earth. They have close to 20,000 white rhinos, which is essentially the majority of white rhinos in Africa, over 95% of them. They also have a very large black rhino population. About a third of the black rhinos in Africa are found in South Africa. But last year, South Africa lost 333 rhinos. The majority of those were white rhinos. The simple reason for that is that there are far more white rhinos than there are black rhinos, so they are targeted first. The primary reason poachers are targeting South Africa is essentially exactly what I just said, that most of the rhinos in the world are found there. So if you're going to go after rhinos, you're going to go after the place where they're found. What's troubling is that the numbers of poached rhinos have been doubling about every year over the past 3 years. And as you can see now, we've reached a rate of just about 1 a day. And what's really troubling is in these first few weeks of this year, we've seen that rate continue. There were about 160 poachers arrested, which is good news, but the downside of that, there were only 4 cases that went through court and resulted in convictions. That's a really dismal rate, and what really has to happen is a focus on making sure that cases are prosecuted, convictions are made, and appropriate sentences are handed down to poachers who are convicted of these crimes. So these are really troubling numbers, and you may ask, okay, so what do we do about it? And as I said in the beginning, this type of situation can seem overwhelming. If South Africa were to try to tackle this situation by itself, it may find itself overwhelmed by these global forces which are acting on this local level. So the solution has been to work in partnership. And here, the World Wildlife Fund has worked in close partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on their Rhino Conservation Fund to bring together regional bodies. We work with existing organizations, and in Southern Africa, there's the Southern African Development Corporation, the SADC countries. It's the development community of Southern African nations. Within SADC, there is a rhino security group. So this is an existing body that is already meeting and functioning and talking to each other, but they need assistance on a technical level, on how to counter poaching, how to work on anti-trafficking of rhino horn and wildlife trade products. They need funding to just bring together people for meetings, to share knowledge and information and ideas. So that's an area where WWF has partnered together with Fish and Wildlife Service to facilitate that kind of an exchange. Additionally, over the past year, WWF, through our wildlife trade partner organization, which is called Traffic, which is a partnership between the World Wildlife Fund and IUCN, the World Conservation Union, facilitated an exchange between customs officials and security officials from South Africa with Vietnam. They actually sent folks from South Africa to Vietnam to talk about rhino horn trade and look for commonalities, to look for ways to address the problem. Why that's significant is that Vietnam has emerged suddenly from nowhere as the primary consumer of rhino horns. Traditionally, it's always been Chinese medicine that's been the primary end point for rhino horn, but now suddenly Vietnam is emerging as a major destination. And I'm not exactly sure why that is, but there are some anecdotal reports that somebody in Vietnam claims to have been cured of cancer by taking rhino horn. It's really a troubling development. Rhino horn was never used to treat cancer in traditional Chinese medicine. But once that rumor is out there, now suddenly you can imagine if you find yourself terminally diagnosed with cancer, you're going to try anything you can, and if you can get your hands on some rhino horn, you want to try it. So we're now actually seeing rhino horn fetching the highest prices in the world in the markets of Vietnam. There is a similar exchange that's on the agenda to happen early this spring to bring Vietnamese officials to South Africa to learn lessons, to share, to begin the dialogue of communicating between themselves. Why this is really important is that, say for example, South Africa arrests a Vietnamese national in South Africa trying to market rhino horn. Now they can talk to their Vietnamese counterparts and say, we've got this guy, here are his fingerprints, is he a known suspect? They can start to do the law enforcement that needs to be done to track people down. And really what it needs to be done is just good law enforcement. So that's why that's important. But then again, this is an example of partnering together, bringing partners together to address global forces that are having a local impact, working at the local level, at the regional level, and globally. This picture is of rhino horns from a rhino that was poached. The poachers got away before they could cut off the rhino horns and escape with them. But now the rhino horns have to be taken into a secure stockpile. This is also a very large burden on rhino range states, countries that have rhinos. They have to stockpile and protect these rhino horns securely with armed guards behind lock and key to make sure, because they're fetching so much money on the open market that people are willing to go in and rob a rhino horn stockpile and take it and sell it. So they've got large stocks of rhino horns under lock and key that they're having to protect, which is a big burden. Similarly, we've partnered with Fish and Wildlife Service and the International Rhino Foundation and other partners in Zimbabwe, in an area called the Lowveld, which is sort of southeastern Zimbabwe. This is an individual named Raul who's been working in one of the longest running partnerships on rhino conservation that we know of. And it's been very successful, and the reason primarily that it's been very successful is that it's got a very tight relationship with local communities. It involves community-based natural resource management. Now, these rhinos are living on communal lands that are owned by local communities. These are not national parks. These rhinos are not living in formal protected areas, national parks, game reserves. They're actually living on community-managed, community-owned lands. Now, when communities have an investment and a buy-in to the natural resources, they realize the benefits from having rhinos on their land. They get money from tourism, so they see a direct benefit, a direct reason to keep rhinos around. And that has resulted in Zimbabwe has had a similar pattern of poaching over the past few years as South Africa. In fact, Zimbabwe has lost close to a quarter of their black rhinos over the past 3 years. But for the most part, those rhinos were poached outside of the communal conservation areas because this area has been highly successful. But one of the projects that Raul has been running is poaching of other species for food is a big problem in this area. So people go out and set snares. Rhinos are not the intended target of snares. It's impossible to catch a rhino in a snare and go out and cut its horn off. But they will break the snare and the cable will stay on the rhino's foot. And if it's not treated, the rhino will eventually lose its foot and could actually die from that. So Raul has been running a veterinary project where he actually goes out in a helicopter and looks for rhinos that have been that are carrying around cable snares, captures them, removes the snares, treats their wounds. In some cases, removes the horn, such as this one, which removes the incentive for the poacher. Rhino horn is primarily keratin, which is the same substance that our fingernails and hair are made of. It's constantly growing like our hair and fingernails, and it will grow back, so it causes no damage at all if you eat more than rhino in this way. But this is an example, again, of a very dedicated partnership that's found long-term sustainable funding on a targeted project to accomplish a mission. And this is an example, again, of communities benefiting from this type of partnership and why that is so critical. Now, when you talk about community-based natural resource management, and especially with rhinos, you have to mention Namibia. And Namibia is the shining success story of CBNRM, community-based natural resource management. And sort of the backstory, what happened in Namibia, the country went through a very long period of civil war, only gained independence in 1990. It was an apartheid state ruled by South Africa. Under that period of apartheid, black Namibians were marginalized, completely pushed aside, had no rights whatsoever, especially what pertains to wildlife, had no management decisions whatsoever. So when Namibia gained independence, ingrained into the constitution in Namibia, into their brand new constitution, they wrote in community rights for management of natural resources. And that has been incredibly empowering because it stated very clearly as a constitutional right that Namibian citizens have the right to have a say in how they manage their wildlife and to benefit from having wildlife on their land. That has been extremely successful. We've seen wildlife numbers over the past 20 to 30 years in Namibia steadily increasing. As a result, Namibia has largely escaped this poaching scourge that we've seen over the past few years in South Africa and Zimbabwe. Here in these photos was an exercise that was undertaken in July of this year, which is another partnership. This was undertaken through the Millennium Challenge account, as well as WWF, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Save the Rhino Trust, and other partners, and most importantly, the government of Namibia. The rhino population has been doing so well that they're actually getting too densely populated in the area that they're found in. They have to actually remove some individuals and move them into new habitats. And the new places where they're going are communal lands, community-based land. So they'll have the chance there now, the communities will have the chance to benefit from having rhinos on their land and to continue to grow from that. Now I'm going to transition into the topic that I know less about, and so thank you for indulgence with me here, but I did want to briefly touch on the second aspect of the case study that I was going to talk about, which is tiger conservation. And another example of building coalitions, building partnerships at a global level to tackle local challenges. And that 2010 was the Chinese, in the Chinese zodiac, was the year of the tiger. And the culmination, the high point of that was the Global Tiger Summit, which occurred in St. Petersburg in Russia in late November. And this brought together the still on rhinos on my mind, the tiger range states to facilitate a dialogue to come up with a global tiger recovery plan. Now each range state brought to the table their own national tiger recovery plans and commitments that they would do to solve the problems of tiger trade, tiger habitat loss, poaching, etc. And so each of these countries came with commitments, and donor countries came with commitments as well. And the U.S. delegation was very important as a donor to the Tiger Summit. And one of the main reasons for this is that the U.S. was ready to come to the table prepared with the Tiger Fund, the Rhino Tiger Fund that's administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as a mechanism already in existence, as a way that we can help us attain the stated goal of the Global Tiger Recovery Plan, which is to double the number of tigers in the wild by the year 2022. So that was also critically important, and another example of building a coalition and a partnership to achieve problems and results for problems. And here's an example of why you have to build coalitions. The problem may be local. In Sumatra and Indonesia, you may see poaching of tigers going on and think that's a local problem, but you may find out that the demand is actually coming from China. So the trade routes where those tiger products are going have to be addressed through multiple different countries. And having a global plan where everyone can work together cooperatively is a way to address the problem that may seem local in nature, but is actually being driven by global forces. Here's an example of some of the tiger products that are found in trade. As I said, with the rhino horn, the primary consumer of tiger products has been China traditionally. And tiger bone has been used for millennia in Chinese medicine. Tiger skins and really all tiger products are used to some degree in traditional Chinese medicine. This little statuette is actually a little container for tiger bone wine, which is also a Chinese medicinal. tiger that was found in Malaysia that was actually trapped in a snare. This tiger unfortunately did not survive that, but snaring is becoming an enormous problem. Snares are extremely cheap to go out and set into the forest. All you need is essentially some cable, some bicycle cables or wire to go out and set a lot of snares, and you may only be successful one time out of 100, but it's a big payoff if you do. And so, again, these tigers being trapped out of Malaysia, which has a really significant tiger population, but it's losing its tigers for this global demand. And the other major aspect of tiger conservation is not poaching, but habitat loss. And poaching is a major, major factor in the reduction of tiger populations, but as well, habitat loss. And this map shows in the yellow areas the former range of tigers, where they formerly occupied most of Asia. Today, it's only estimated that tigers occupy 7% of their former range. Most of that habitat is gone and will not be recovered. Most of that has been developed. Asia is one of the most densely populated places on the planet. So most of these areas have been developed and populated, but there are large population units remaining intact, and tigers will have a chance to recover if they're left alone. If they're free from poaching, if there's enough prey, tigers will recover. And tigers obviously are cats, and they breed like cats, and if they're left alone, they can recover in a very short time. So there is hope. The situation is not bleak. It's not time to give up, because there is hope. So the takeaway message that I wanted to leave today with is that protection of species like tigers, rhinos, and elephants has a lot of carry-on benefits. It's vitally important that we protect these species from going extinct just because they are the species that we identify with. But if tigers, rhinos, elephants, great apes are doing well in their habitats, that means those habitats are doing well. The forests are healthy. If forests are healthy, then the watersheds are healthy. If watersheds are healthy, people have a clean source of drinking water. If forests are intact, the carbon is intact that's in those forests, which offsets the potential for global climate change. So there are an enormous amount of carry-on benefits that come from protecting a species. You protect the entire ecosystem, you protect the habitat, and it protects our livelihoods as well. And we've seen time after time again where people can benefit from species conservation, especially with rhinos, the examples in Africa that I gave, where it's a win-win situation. Protecting rhinos is good for rhinos, it's also good for people. People benefit and rhinos benefit. But the key to all of this is partnerships. And that's what I would be trying to do. Thank you all for your time.
Hi all. I just wanted to take 2 minutes, less than 2 minutes, I think, to very briefly introduce myself to those of you that I don't know. My name is Andy Oliver, and I am the new coordinator for the Multinational Species Coalition, taking over from John Gerbers, who did a tremendous job over the last 10 years. I used to work here in Congress for Congressman Saxton, who was a terrific guy and ably represented what is now the 3rd District of New Jersey for 24 years. He was very senior on the Natural Resources Committee, and I was very happy that during my tenure with him, we actually reauthorized the Asian Elephant Conservation Fund with Mr. Saxton as a sponsor, and he was always a great supporter of these programs. So it's really nice to be working with the coalition and helping to carry on that legacy. Just to wrap up very quickly, and because I am new, I'm actually going to read this, so I apologize. But wildlife conservation programs are a modest but essential piece of the United States engagement with the developing world. Through the Multinational Species Conservation Fund programs, the United States supplements the efforts of developing countries that are struggling to balance the needs of their human populations and endemic wildlife. The Multinational Species Conservation Funds help sustain wildlife populations, address threats by controlling illegal poaching, reducing human-wildlife conflict, and protecting essential habitat. By working with local communities, they also improve people's livelihoods, contribute to local and regional stability, and support U.S. security interests in impoverished regions. The Multinational Species Conservation Fund has been extraordinarily successful at leveraging partnerships with corporations and non-governmental organizations to magnify its effectiveness. These programs have leveraged more than 3 times the U.S. federal investment through matching contributions from public and private partners. And you saw a number of those great partnerships in our presentations today. I mean, just examples of them. The fund has helped stabilize or increase key populations of tigers in the Russian Far East, rhinos in parts of Africa and Asia, and gorillas in East Africa. These programs have broad support from conservationists, zoos, circuses, sportsmen, veterinarians, and animal welfare groups. And I just wanted to leave you with that as a take-home message. We want to sincerely thank the International Conservation Caucus Foundation for bringing together this briefing today, and hope that you found it useful. Thanks very much.